Thank you everybody for coming today. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Kirby. I am the technical manager for the UK and Ireland for Syngenta in sports stuff. I don't normally come over to the Nordics, but I do love it whenever Lars asks me to come and give him a hand, because I get to look at something a little bit different, or I look at things from a different point of view. That is what I looked like before lockdown. I've now lost all my hair completely because of homeschooling. Right, so what are we going to look at today? We're going to have a look at what GDD is, Growth Degree Days. I heard a lot of talk about it as a turf manager, which I used to be. I was 25 years out on the ground. I looked at it several times, and I'll be honest, it all seemed more hassle than it was worth to me. But now I've got a chance to look at things and understand it, and we've got a system that could make it a bit easier for you if it's the right thing for you to do. So we're going to look at today how you can use it and what you can get out of it. We're going to have a good look at what base temperature is, because I think base temperature has been a bit confusing in the past. And I'm going to try and simplify that for you so we understand how to get the very best out of it. We're going to have a look at using growth degree days to monitor growth, which is something that is very different to the next thing, which is how we can use it to improve a Primo Maxx Programme. So using the same tool, but in a different way to achieve two different things. And then we're just going to have a look at the Greencast tool, which makes this as simple as possible for you. And hopefully you'll have a pretty good understanding at the end of it of how you can use all of these tools and all these bits and pieces to get more out of your program. So what is it? What are growth degree days? Well, they're a really simple model. Growth degree days are a really simple temperature-based modeling system to help understand grass growth and build better programs. They take some very simple equations from the temperature of that individual day, and they break them down and generate a number. Why do we use GDD? So what is the point of it? Well, the point of GDD is to help you fine-tune something. Now, that could be a number of things. You can use GDD to measure grass growth. You can use it to measure how long products last. You can use it to look at insect growth. There's a number of things you can do with it. So why use it? It's going to help you make more informed and better decisions on how you put your programs together. What can we measure with it? So the kind of things that can be measured with growth degree days are longevity of products, plant growth, insect development, timing of flowering. There are a number of ways that growth degree days models are used. If you look into agriculture, they're using these kind of models a lot. But be realistic, they are very simple models that are just taking some simple elements of your weather data and generating a number. But we talk a lot about it in turf, and I think we talk about it with Primo, and we kind of forget about the other things that can be achieved or other things that it can influence our decision-making processes on. So how do we pull a growth degree day figure together? Well, a growth degree day figure is simply a number allocated to that day that you are in. Then you can add those numbers up over a period of time to help you make those decisions. So how do we generate that number? What goes on? Well, traditionally, we used to take a high temperature and a low temperature for the day, and then we needed a base temperature. So as time has gone on, what used to happen was we would have our thermometer in our greenkeeping facilities somewhere that would register a high temperature and a low temperature, and then we would plug those numbers into a spreadsheet and it would generate a base temperature. Now, what that equation looks like is very simple. It's like this. So you take your highest temperature of the day, let's say 20 degrees, and you take your lowest temperature of the day, let's say 10 degrees. You divide that by 2, so you get 15, and then you minus the base temperature. Now, the base temperature is critical to this because different base temperatures will do different things. But what you can see from that is you are creating this bottom end figure. So if your maximum temperature and your minimum temperature divided by 2 equal less than your base temperature, then you are 0. You are generating 0 growth degree days. And that is the clue. The base temperature is critical to understanding this process. Now, rather than using spreadsheets and things like that, which was the kind of the way we did it whilst I was managing a golf course, you would physically have to take the temperature from your weather station or your thermometer, and you would plug it into a spreadsheet and you would work out your growth degree days. What we've now set up at Syngenta within the Greencast website is a system that does it for you. So what you have here is you have a column of dates. You have the high and the low temperature that was recorded on that site. And then it generates your growth degree days automatically for you, and it accumulates them over the year. So we've taken a lot of that kind of, it's not a complicated thing to do, but it's still something that has to be done every day. We've taken that away and we've created a system that works for you. Over on the left-hand side, you can see that you can adjust your location and you can adjust the base temperature, and you can also backdate this as far as you want. There are some other opportunities in there that I'll discuss a little bit later, but this will generate your daily growth degree days. This will generate that figure for you. And this is interesting because if you look at Istad here in Sweden, which is why I quite like doing these things, I get to look at some different areas of the world that I wouldn't normally focus on. You can see during this period, when I put this presentation together, we were generating no daily growth degree days. There was nothing going on. It was too cold for anything to happen. During that same period, just out of interest, I did it from my home where I am now. So if any of you are ever in the area, feel free to come and visit. And you can see through that same period, we were generating some different growth degree days. We had a different temperature range there. We were still hitting some cold days where we were hitting -4.5, but equally we were jumping in and out of some warmer temperatures where we had kind of 12 degrees, maximum 10 degrees overnight. And you can see how we start generating different daily growth degree day figures. Now, that makes sense because if you take where I am to Ystad over there, where in Sweden, you would be making different agronomic decisions in those two climates. You would be doing different things. And this is really a tool that is allowing you to generate a number to kind of back up your experience and help you make those right turf management decisions. So how do we pick that base temperature? I've mentioned a couple of times how important that base temperature is. That base temperature is the bottom end figure that the model stops. So if you take your maximum temperature, your minimum temperature, you work out the average of those, and then you're minusing that base temperature. So what is the point? What can we measure with the different base temperatures? So what you want to then do is you take away that base temperature from that equation. So if grass growth stops at 6 degrees, then 6 degrees is your base temperature. So if you are trying to measure grass growth, then you should use 6 degrees as a base temperature. Now, there are 3 standard growth degree day figures that you'll see floating around within turf. There's hundreds in agriculture and other areas, but you'll see 3 mentioned regularly in turf. You'll see 6 degrees, which we're talking about here. Now, 6 degrees is excellent for grass growth, really good way of measuring grass growth, because at 6 degrees, generally, turf will stop growing. 10 degrees is the other one you'll see mentioned quite a lot, and it gets quite confusing because when you start looking at reading these literary reviews, or you start reading reports from over in America about base temperatures and GDD models, you'll see some of them using 10 degrees. Well, 10 degrees is there for warm season turf. So warm season as a standard, if you hit 10 degrees, that is when turf will stop growing at 10 degrees. So if you're using warm season turf, which none of us, I don't think on this call are using, then 10 degrees is your base temperature. Now, the third one you'll see mentioned is 0. Now, the Americans use 0 a lot. Australia use zero a lot. Over in the UK, we've tended not to use zero, and I've always been a little bit confused about that, and I think it has blurred the picture a bit. But the more I look at it, the more I think zero is the right thing to use when we're looking at growth degree day programs, because if we're trying to measure the longevity of a product, that product will probably degrade all the way down to zero. I'm getting a bit of feedback, so if anyone's got their mic on, could they just turn it off for me? Thank you. So zero is the best base temperature to use to measure longevity of product. Now, we don't tend to use that in the UK. We tend to use 6 because we've got a bit caught up in measuring grass growth with it and trying to make one model 2 things. But within the Greencast setup, it's really easy to switch from 6 to 0, so it has no impact on anything you're doing. You just flick that switch over to 0 and use 0 to measure longevity of products. And if you think about that, if you've got a product in the ground, you would expect it to be breaking down microbially over time. It would be getting used all the way down to 0, to that point it freezes. If you freeze it, then you would expect it to kind of stop degradation. But apart from that, you would expect it to be breaking down, albeit slowly. So if you want to measure grass growth in our kind of climate in cool season, it's 6 degrees. If you want to measure product degradation, it is 0 degrees. So we're going to have a little look here at how we can use GDD to measure grass growth. So what we're going to look at is using 6 degrees as a base temperature. So what I've done is I've taken some data out of the Greencast website and I've looked at 4 sites. Forgive me if I pronounce these incorrectly, but we've got Stavanger, Sundsvall, Helsinki, and Ystad. So we've got 4 areas. I thought it'd be really interesting to look at, using growth degree days, how we can map what your turf is doing through last year. So what I've got here is Helsinki to start with, and you can see I've plotted every day through the 2020 year on a graph showing how many growth degree days you got. And using that website, that Greencast tool, you can grab this same data that I've got here. So you can see we had a period of very little growth all the way through the early part of the season, and then it's interesting to see how you take off and quite quickly you start moving up into some very high growth degree days. What's interesting for last year is you saw a peak in the spring and then you dropped off through peak summer and you jumped back up, and you'll see that across all the 4 locations. So if we move over to Stavanger, you can see a very similar pattern. Doesn't look like it has grown as much. We're not seeing quite as many high up big numbers around kind of 16, 17, 18, but we're seeing a very similar pattern. And this is what that Greencast tool is doing. It is generating a figure every day, if you're using 6 degrees as a base temperature, to generate a figure associated with the amount of growth you're likely to see. You can see Ystad here. We've seen a very similar pattern again. It looks like it's taking off a little bit earlier. Things are growing earlier. And the solid line through the middle is a 25-day rolling average. So that's just the average over that period. And then again, if we look at Sundsvall, you'll see a different picture. Again, it looks like a narrower window, but higher levels of growth. Now, if we throw all of those onto one chart, it's a very messy chart, but you can start seeing the different patterns of growth you've got around the different areas there. And that makes sense because climatically, they're all going to be slightly different. So the red line is Ystad, it's the furthest south. It was the quickest to start moving into some growth periods. The black line is Stavanger, that moved along quite quickly, but didn't reach the same peak of growth as the other areas of the other destinations we've looked at. So you can start to see what's going on there. You can start to see how they've all got very separate growth patterns, and you can see how that works. Now, what I did then was I thought, well, I'll have a look and see how where I am differs from that. So we are much further over to the west and lower, and you can see our growth pattern is very different to yours. So where I am, it's very rare, or through 2020, we didn't go into those periods of no growth at all. All the way through, we had some growth going on. We were much earlier to take off. But we were much slower to take off as well. We went from kind of lowish growth through medium growth all the way to a little bit of high growth in the middle of the year, and then we dropped back down again gradually. Whereas the 4 other climates we're looking at here, you can see they are very, very flat, and then they go into very severe very quickly, which is a really interesting way of looking at it. So that's using 6 degrees as a base temperature. So that's measuring plant growth. What we now want to look at is how we can use those growth degree day figures to help you build a better Primo program. So how can you use these figures to improve what you're doing? And before we do that, there's a few things we need to understand about Primo and how it works. So Primo as a product is a very good plant growth regulator. It is excellent at slowing down the growth rate, the upward growth rate of the plant. It moves that energy into sideways growth and extra tillering, and it will shorten the distance between the nodes. And it is doing all of that by effectively putting a dam in place to stop gibberellic acid creating that elongated growth. So what you're doing is you're putting this dam in place. Primo's putting this dam in place to stop the grass growing. It's stopping that gibberellic acid production. The challenge with that comes when that dam runs out, then you will see an unlocking of all that gibberellic acid. So you will see what is known as a rebound effect. So you can see slightly more growth than you would normally expect to see because the plant is unlocking that. What we want to manage as turf managers is this constant level of growth throughout the season with it, this constant level of suppression without going into too much reduction and then rebound effect where we're seeing more. So that's what we're trying to manage when we're looking at managing a Primo effect. If we want to think about how to use Primo properly, we need to think about what level of suppression we're trying to achieve and how long it lasts. What I've got here is a graph that is showing a very hypothetical situation of the black line being your standard level of growth. The green, blue, and the red are the amount of reduction, the suppression in grass growth you get. And then after the line, you get this rebound effect. So you get this kind of bounce back. Now, it's not as advanced or as kind of escalated as that looks, but that's the concept. Now, if you want to increase the rate of suppression, so reduce the amount of grass you are cutting, you can increase the rate. There are some label restrictions and you need to pay careful attention to that. But if you look at this chart here, it will show you exactly that in a study. By going up to 0.4 litres a hectare, we reduce the level of clippings that we're removing. Up to 0.8, we reduce it again, and you can keep going all the way through. The more Primo you put on, the more you will suppress the growth. And in this study, we were reducing clippings by about 33%. Now that's variable depending on the species of turf grass you're using, the height of cut you've got, the amount of stress that plant is under when it's applied, the climatic conditions. There's a lot of variables in there. But the higher you go rate-wise with Primo, the more suppression you're going to get. What you're not necessarily going to do is increase the longevity, though. There are some small differences. You can increase it slightly, but in general, by adjusting the rate, you do not increase the longevity of the product. There we go. The reason for that is that Primo is related to temperature. The longevity of Primo is heavily related to the climate that it's in. The warmer it is, the quicker it will break down. The cooler it is, the slower the breakdown process is. Now, it has what is known as a temperature-related half-life. And we've got a diagram here that shows, again, hypothetically, what is happening during this situation. So we have the two extreme rates on this chart of 3.2 litres a hectare and all the way down at the bottom, 0.2 litres a hectare. And after a certain set period, that will reduce by 50%. And that is dependent on the temperature. The warmer it is, the quicker it will get to that point. And you can see the next stage here. So move it on again, and it will reduce by 50%. And quite quickly, those rates get very close together. So the difference later on in its life cycle is very little compared to the rate. So when you're looking at your rates and you're kind of looking at a green type situation where you might be 0.2 litres a hectare or you might be 0.4 litres a hectare, there is very little difference longevity wise between those two rates. There'll be a subtle difference, but it's very little. There may well be a difference between 0.2 litres a hectare and 3.2 litres a hectare, but you'll be very rarely in a situation where you'll be going with one or the other of those two rates. You'll either be up around kind of 3.2 or 2.5, or you'll be down at the kind of 0.2, 0.4, depending on what you're trying to achieve. There we go. A bit slow at this end. And this is all backed up and supported by University of Nebraska. They've done a lot of work on this, far more work than we have done in the UK. And if you look at this graph on the left-hand side, what it is doing, they've taken a number of clipping yield data studies over time, and they've added these all up and they've worked out to see this very loose curve that we have created that we're trying to replicate here. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to get in there and apply our Primo before we get into this point where you see this aggressive rebound effect, this regrowth. Now, don't get too worried about the rebound effect. It's very different for every situation. Some places learn to try almost to use it to their advantage. But what we're trying to do is get in that period of early suppression. And then the graph on the right shows this situation where the warmer it is, the shorter that period of time. The cooler it is, the longer that takes. So we want to take all of that information and then we want to learn how we can build that into a growth degree day program to get the very best out of it. So as a standard figure of advice, a standard piece of advice, we would recommend with Primo a growth degree day figure interval of 200 growth degree days. Now that is at 0 base temperature. That's really important to know. If for some reason you want to use 6 degrees, then we would recommend around 125 to 150. But 6 base temperature isn't as accurate as a 0 base temperature would be. So I would recommend a 0 degree base temperature when looking at Primo programs. But as much as I love all this science and all the rest of it and kind of these precise applications, I think we shouldn't get too hung up on that one figure. 200 is very, very specific. I think we should be looking at it as a range rather than a specific figure. Because when you're looking at these things, the specific figure will always fall on the day where your spray operator's not there, or it's the weekend, or it's too windy, or it's too wet, or you've got a big golf competition going on and you can't get that sprayer out. So look at it as a range. And the reason I say that is because we are trying to get into this hypothetical point in the curve. We don't want to be applying our second application or our third application of Primo before it reaches the bottom of its curve, before it reaches its maximum period of suppression. We want to be getting somewhere between the bottom of that curve and the point where it runs out. And as we look at the different temperature ranges, so this is a kind of medium temperature range, that period gets wider and wider. So the cooler it is, the longer your interval. And same again, it just extends out. So if we look at that curve, this is what I feel that curve looks like. I think you reach your peak level of suppression right at the bottom at around 150 growth degree days, 0 base temperature. We reached probably the optimum application date at 200, but we don't want to let it run for more than 250. So that's where we're looking. That's our sweet spot in at that 200, but you've probably got 25 growth degree days either way to really nail that. Now, if you think back to the graph we were looking at early, some of you through the peak of summer are hitting 18 growth degree days a day. So that's only 2 or 3 days either way during the peak of your summer to get the very best out of your Primo applications. Something that we've built into the Greencast website that's really handy for this is a threshold monitor. So if you go into Greencast, you select the view your threshold progress, you can go in there and you can set these thresholds. So you can set the start date, you can set the number of growth degree days you want to go from now until that next one. And then it will start sending you emails. So when you reach 80% of that, it will send you an email to remind you you are getting very close to your threshold. And then on the day of it, when they think you're going to hit it, it will send you another email to remind you that you're getting on that day. So it's a really nice way of helping timing your applications without you having to do all the work on the spreadsheets, and remember to put all of that data in. Hello, I'm on a call at the moment, so can you leave me to it, please? Please, Evie? Yeah, okay. Everyone, do you want to say hello to my daughter? There's 150 people on this call, darling. Sorry. Okay, so if we have a look at what is going on here, we have these 4 venues. And from the 1st of May 2020, so this is taking your data from last year. If we have a look at that curve, we're trying to hit that optimum 200 growth degree days. On the 1st of May last year, for those 4 venues, it would have taken 27 days to reach it in Stavanger, 29 days in Sundsvall, 24 days in Helsinki, and 20 days in Ystad. So you can start to see there the differences between the different climates and different regions. June, so what would have happened once we move through to June? So in June, you were looking at around 13 days in Stavanger, 11 days in Sundsvall, 11 days in Helsinki, and 12 days in Ystad. Now that was this last year. It's not an average. This is the difference between, this is just the difference between those venues at that time of year. So you may have had some cooler weather going on, different climates, different things, all sorts of stuff. So if we look at July, then things start stretching out a little bit in July. Remember, we were seeing that peak through the spring, and then it dropped off a little bit again and then moved back into another peak. And you can start seeing it here in the growth degree days. It stretched out. So Stavanger, we moved up to 17 days in July last year, 14 days in Sundsvall, 14 days in Helsinki, and 14 days in Ystad. So it stretched out a little bit. If we go to August, and we came back in again because the temperature warmed up, we were back in a warmer situation. So you were around 12, 13 days across the 4 venues. Once we move through to September, though, things start stretching out again, as you would expect. Temperature starts dropping. We got around 18 days in Stavanger, 18 days in Sundsvall, 17 days in Helsinki, yet the temperatures were still holding on that bit longer down in Ystad. So the optimum window down there would have still been at 14 days. So when we look at that, to get the best out of your Primo, you are still looking at a 14-day interval in September last year in some areas of your region. We flip over to October, though, and this is where your big differences draw out. 27 days in Stavanger, 48 days up in Sundsvall. So we've really reached that point there where the temperature has dropped off and it's too cold, and we're getting loads of longevity out of the product, so you can back right off. Helsinki, 28 days, and 20 days in Ystad. But if we look at that across the whole season, so from the 1st of May through to the end of October, a hypothetical timescale, you can see that we haven't used a huge difference in the number of applications across the country. So you would have been looking around 10 in Stavanger, 10 in Sundsvall, 11 in Helsinki, and 12 in Ystad. So not necessarily a big difference in the number of apps, but there would have been some differences in the optimum timing between those applications. And this is just a little graph that kind of summarizes what we're trying to achieve here. If we're trying to use a growth degree day based application, what we're trying to do is time it. So as one product is reaching the end of its life, the other one gets applied. So if we use a growth degree day program, we'll be doing something like this. You can see the Primo is running quite a long time on the bottom one. And then we start the second application just as it's running out. But this one's not lasting as long because the temperature has warmed up. So it's going to last a shorter period of time. The next one, very short period of time because we've gone into this peak growing season now. That might well be the period of time that we were looking at there, where we're only getting 9 days out of this. We apply the next one. The temperature has dropped right off, so we get some really nice longevity out of this one. This is lasting much longer. And then the same again for this last one. We're applying it just as we know it's running down, and we're going to get some more out of it. You compare that to the alternate, though, the way that a lot of people are using Primo currently on a either fortnightly or monthly basis. And this is what we're starting to achieve. So we've got the same kind of set of figures going on here. The first one is going on for a decent period of time because we are starting early. We apply the next one on a calendar basis. What we're doing there, though, is we're overlapping the two. So once we've overlapped those two products, what we're going to get is twice as much suppression. So we're going through a cool period of the year where we're probably trying to encourage some growth. And what we've done is we've double suppressed it with Primo. And both of those are now going to run out at about the same time. They're going to be very close to each other when they run out. So we're going to see twice as much rebound. So we're going to see extra levels of suppression going on. And then all of a sudden, extra levels of rebound coming out the other side. So at a time when we're trying to achieve consistent growth, what we're doing is we're making things worse. The next one has gone on another 2-week basis, but we've come out of the suppression from the last one. And then we've got a big gap, and then we're going to try and get it back under control again. We look another 2 weeks down the line, and we've left this big gap again. So we've come out of suppression. We've got this rebound effect going on, which will be variable depending on a number of different circumstances. For some, it will be more than others, before we try and go back into suppression. And then the last one will come in, and that will overlap again. And just as we're moving into the cooler periods, what we're then doing is we're double applying effectively over the top of each other. And at a time where we want growth, we're actually going to be suppressing it. So when we're looking at Primo and what we're trying to do with controlling growth, elongating or shortening the rates depending on the temperature is really important to getting the very best out of it. The threshold tool on the growth degree days section of the website is really useful for this. You can set these thresholds and you'll get these reminders. You can ask whether it just repeats itself once you hit it, or you can go in and reset them. And it's a really nice way of giving you a guide to better time these applications. So 200 growth degree days at 0 base temperature is our recommendation for Primo. So hopefully this screen is very slow. On the back of today, I hope I haven't gone on too long. It's a very complex subject that doesn't need to be as complex as some people make out. Hopefully you'll understand what growth degree days is. A really simple model of today's average temperature minus the base temperature. How can you use it? Well, you can use growth degree days on a number of different ways, depending on what base temperature you select in that box. So if you want to measure grass growth, have a look at 6. And that gives you a really good indication of what's going on with grass growth. If you want to measure longevity of product, then use 0. And then you can start looking at what period of time you think you're going to get out of it. What base temperature can you use? Like I say, 0 is great for measuring product. 6 is great for measuring turf. I wouldn't recommend trying to mix the two up. It's so simple within that Greencast website. You can go and do that really easily now. You can use it to monitor growth. Hopefully you'll have a good idea. You can go in and you can look at that, and you can look at historic records to see when things started happening, when they started dropping off over the years. All really useful information. Hopefully you've got a better idea of how to understand and improve your Primo Maxx program. If you're looking at growth regulation, in my opinion, it's really important to get as consistent a level of suppression throughout the year. By using growth degree days, you can work to getting much closer towards that. Don't get too hung up on the exact number. You've got a range either side, but remember, the warmer it is, the shorter that range becomes, because those growth degree day figures, they're mounting up on a daily basis. You don't necessarily use more Primo, you just use it in a much more effective and efficient manner. And hopefully I've given you a bit of an insight on how to use that GDD tool. Best way is to simply go in and play. I've got all sorts of thresholds in there. You can put a few of them in there, call them something, have a play, have a look and see what you can do with it. That's pretty much me summarised. I see there's a few questions come in, so hopefully me and Lars can have a bit of discussion about some of those. GDD is a big subject. It is quite complex, but it doesn't need to be. It's quite simple. Once we go to that next level of understanding and wanting to fine tune it, I generally learn more from the people that are using it than they do from me. What I can do is understand the basics, but use it, play with it, see what works for you on your site, and we can get that dialed in and you can find something that works for you. If you want to get in contact with me, then there's my email address on the screen, my Twitter handle's on there. The Syngenta UK Twitter handle is on there. I should have put Lars's on there as well. Sorry, Lars. There's Greencast Advisory. I do a blog which is under the Greencast Advisory Turf Management blog headline. Come in and find us.
Thanks, Glenn. Thank you very much, Glenn. Really, really good. I hope a lot of you guys got a lot of clarity of the growing degree days, and hopefully understand it more. And hopefully you will also spend some time on greencast.se and play around a little bit with it, understand it a bit, and then maybe you can start off and use it the coming year as well, coming season.